That's my dog. He gonna always hold me down. That's my dog. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webcast. It's a real pleasure to be here with Mueni and Akisha, two amazing people, and they were amazing before they came to CARE. Appreciate them so much. I will let them introduce themselves and their role with CARE, and then we'll jump right into it. But I'm James Evans, the CEO and founder of CARE, and I should say early on, with great appreciation to Chaitan Merrill and Spring Point Life O'Reilly for being our original donors, and Chaitana in particular being the impetus for starting CARE. We will forever be grateful for her insight. And with that, Mueni and then Akisha, you want to introduce yourselves?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mueni Rudd. I have the pleasure of serving as Senior Director of Research and Development at CARE.
And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Akisha Townsend Eaton, and I am the new Chief of Policy of the Environmental Justice Division at CARE.
Oh, thank you. I love the way that sounds. So it's Black History Month, and in my mind, it is Anti-Black Erasure Month. It's important to, I think, recognize the full breadth of the African American experience here in this country. American Black History Month, full of, I think, darkness and sadness, as dark as it comes, but also filled with an immense amount of love, immense amount of resistance. One of the things we're going to talk about is, Black resistance. And I think Black survival is Black resistance, because I often wonder how we even made it, how we survived. I think about that on almost a daily basis as I traverse through Baltimore, quite frankly, wondering if I'm going to make it home from wherever I'm going and coming from. So I'm just going to jump in and just talk about just raw data. I'm going to pitch this to you, Mueni. Just give the folks just an idea of how many people of color, specifically Black people, live in the country. Because I think if you're from Philly or you're from Baltimore or you live in Atlanta, you think the whole country is Black. But give us some kind of scope of what that looks like around the country.
Yeah, sure. So I guess most recent data usually alludes to 12% of the African diaspora in the world lives in America. And just so folks understand, there's probably like 4 regions of the world where most Black or people of African descent live. And so France, Brazil, United States, and Haiti, but United States has about 12% of that.
Yeah. And by the way, for folks that don't know, people of color in general make up the largest percentage of people in the world. So a lot of the things that we struggle with around the world, but specifically in the US, are not necessarily what folks are struggling with around the world, because the world is incredibly brown. And so it kind of spotlights how deficient the US is when it comes to understanding and relating to people of color. So I'm going to hop into the next question, which I think is, I wish we could spend all day talking about this, because to me, erasure is, there's 2 forms of it. There's genocide, right? There is the actual killing and removing of people you don't like, AKA Jews in Germany in World War II era. That's a certain kind of erasure. But the erasure we face was not physical, but it's actually a erasure of narrative, right? So not only are we erased in terms of our contributions to the country, but then that erasure is filled with all of these negative stereotypes that happened primarily after slaves were emancipated, almost at the door, connecting Black folks with criminality. So the contribution part of all this is so important. And Akisha, I just learned just a little about your mother, a Black educator, and I was just blown away by her immense achievements. So I don't know if you want to, touch on Black educators or people aside from your mom that you feel, very connected to in terms of their contributions to the country. And then obviously, Mueni, I'm going to ask you the same question.
Yeah, I mean, I think education, which we were denied, really, in terms of being able to learn how to read and learn about our world during times of slavery, as we, evolved and survived, in our societies, education is so critical to who we are. So you mentioned my mom. So my mom was actually born in a home. She was not allowed to be born in a hospital because our town was segregated at that time, legally segregated. And she went to segregated schools all the way up until her first year of college at the University of Kentucky, where, this is before the Civil Rights Act even, which is always just amazing for me to think about both of my parents who were able to kind of break down barriers and make it that far. I know if I were in that position, I would be really, really intimidated. She actually had someone, a professor during her freshman year, who was very opposed to Negro students entering institutions, integrated institutions of public education, say, I have never had a Negro student. I've never given a Negro student higher than a C in my course. I don't expect for a Negro student to make any higher than a C. My mom made the dean's list. She was a straight A student, that semester and many other semesters, and really just, was instrumental to me and watching her interact with students and parents who weren't always welcoming, because we lived in, up until very recently, our community was approximately anywhere from 93 to 95% white. We have recently, our demographics have shifted quite a bit in the last 15 to 20 years. But she really instilled upon me, the value of education, but also, being, and adopting humanitarian values. She planted the seed for my involvement in the animal movement. And, there's so many folks in history who are educators by profession, but also maybe they were ministers, maybe they were veterinarians, Black folks who have been erased from our history, who have promoted the humane treatment of animals and animal welfare in general, which I've even learned about them recently, dating back to the 1800s, some really key figures. So, and maybe I'll get into some of those a little bit later, but we're now in a space where education is being threatened. I don't know if you want me to go into this, James, right now, the critical race theory, or we're gonna
we'll hold on that, but we're going to get into it. But yeah, I appreciate that, especially the education side, because my family, particularly my great grandparents, were all sharecroppers, and so I knew and met them as illiterate people. And then my grandmother being illiterate because her father was illiterate. And so it's a really interesting thing to think about how close the effects of slavery still are today. So with that, Mueni, tell us. I'm always curious, like what when I say people that are sort of touchstones of color, Black folks, who comes to mind for you?
So being in the setting that we're in, I would be remiss if I didn't say Tuskegee University and their phenomenal program, their veterinarian program that has been pushing out Black veterinarians for years. So I encourage everyone here to please check out Tuskegee if you don't know who they are and the great work that they're doing to make sure Black voices and our presence is in the animal welfare field. But as critical thinkers, people that I think are rooted in Black liberation movement and thought. I would definitely say Bell Hooks, who has recently passed away. And then, in the 70s, the Keumbi River Collective, these are Black women who gave us this idea of Black liberation and what that means and very applicable, steps on how to create brave space that is respectful for Black lives. So really encourage folks to check those kind of resources out. But, there are folks today, modern folks who are doing this work. And so I think practicing ethical citation and being intentional and mindful of where you receive your information about Black experiences is key to filtering some of that stuff out.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, there are so many, including relatives that I've just seen ascend to great heights, and but authors like I love James Baldwin. There's just something tenacious in his voice. Isabel Wilkerson, and it's not so much. I mean, she has a reporter's gaze into history, so she doesn't necessarily put her emotions into it, but the way she lays it out in such a logical, clear way, both in Warmth of Other Suns and in Caste. I think we have a amazingly rich history that most folks go without. Not only are there no real curriculums to teach Black history in most schools, because most Black folks have to go and find it themselves. But even when it's taught, it's in such a micro, when really we are the bedrock of how this country became a superpower. But inside this field, obviously, there's Dr. Lila Miller that Maddie's has recognized several times. I've talked to Dr. Miller for hours, and it is amazing. She said literally trying to become a veterinarian almost killed her. Just the school that she was attending at the time literally put her in places that jeopardized her life. And what amazed me, though, was, I started in animal welfare in 2008, and I hadn't heard of Dr. Lila Miller until 2020. I've gone to numerous animal welfare conventions and talks, and I've never seen a person of color on the stage. I didn't know Akisha existed in this space. And as it turns out, she's a great thinker in the space. And so, I don't blame any of this on animal welfare. This is the condition in which the country operates. But I think that we know enough now to do better so that people like Akisha and Dr. Miller and Mueni don't disappear in the future, which I intend for that not to happen. But speaking of some of the work you've been involved in, Akisha, can you give us just a debrief on the PETS Act and how that affects BIPOC people and African Americans in particular?
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad that you brought that up. As we're speaking right now, we are facing severe weather. The Pets Act was actually passed after Hurricane Katrina, which many of us, remember very well. I know that I was introduced to your work during that time, James, as well. Very important. The Pets Act basically is a federal law that requires cities, towns, municipalities and states to account for the needs of people with pets, including evacuation, in order to receive certain federal funding, disaster-related federal funding. The reason why that came about was because you had a lot of people, and BIPOC folks, that stayed behind, did not evacuate. A lot of folks lost their lives, died with their pets, drowned, because they were not allowed the opportunity to evacuate with them. I knew about the Pets Act coming in. This was before my time in law school, shortly after graduating college. So at the time that it was passed, I wasn't actually aware of the legislation. It was just as I was coming in. I never heard about those stories. I never heard about Hurricane Katrina inspiring the Pets Act. I just heard we have this Pets Act, and we need to utilize it to make sure that pets are protected in disasters. Not necessarily the people with the pets, but the pets. And this is really poignant to me because my entry into care was really inspired by a recent tragedy in my own state. Many of you are familiar with the tornadoes that destroyed much of some of the areas in Kentucky. My community was one of those, and the Pets Act really laid the foundation for not repeating those same misfortunes that happened during Hurricane Katrina. But we have a lot of improvement to do as well. In my community, the majority of folks that were killed, if not all of them, were in the BIPOC community. A lot of them were, coming from different countries. English was they were English language learners. So there were some barriers there that weren't really accounted for. But that in a nutshell is the Pets Act, and it just speaks to the reality that animals are facing the same conditions that the people that they live with are facing, and in order to really make good comprehensive change for them, you really need to address both issues, if not focus primarily on the people. So
that brings me to the Pets Act, the Voting Act of 1964, and all those things, all these acts, right? It really makes me think so often about how we've come from being formerly enslaved to where we are today with rights and all these things. And we often talk about this at home, but this concept that everything that we have as a right or a protection for African Americans had to be fought for tooth and nail. Even Martin Luther King's birthday was something that was fought over for almost 10 years. The celebration of his birthday. Obviously, his birthday came with his birth, but the idea that America in any way has been generous to Black folks is not at all true. And it's interesting to me. I think we see ourselves as this light on a shining hill, when in reality we're constantly fighting for some form of justice and reciprocity. And so with that, Mueni, I'm going to ask you to tell me what you think of when I say, what is Black radical resistance? What does that look like to you, considering the fact that it seems like it has to exist for us to have any kind of life form at all in this country?
I am definitely regurgitating ideas, those of, the scholars that I reference, because you know what, it's more simple than we think. It's just harder for people to accept than we'd like to admit. That Black radical resistance or radical love or, radical acceptance is accepting Black people in all forms. So that intersectional complex identities of Black folks, that we are not a monolith, that we are experiencing this world in different ways, and the delivery and movement with us has to be flexible. I think that it's an exchange of power to us. I hear a lot of folks in DEI, committees or whatever the case, that are supposedly doing this work, and they are moving as far away from race as possible. And so unfortunately, when race is the furthest thing, there is a racial hierarchy that exists within white supremacy, and Black people, unfortunately, are suffering at the heels of that. And so that radical resistance is us creating our own space. And if conspirators want to participate in that Black radical resistance, then it's giving us power, not just space, and creating that safe space. I think it's more of creating a brave space where folks are taking ownership, particularly historically privileged folks, white folks are taking ownership of those spaces and giving us the power we need to be key players, because just being invited to the table doesn't reduce harm for us. And it doesn't guarantee that we have any real power at that table.
No doubt. I knew you were going to give me something fiery. You and I actually met at one of those tables, and we don't need to name what the table was, but my experience at that table was exactly what yours was. In many DEI positions, we're being asked to be at a table to leverage our insights, but not to provide power and agency. And it's mind-blowing to me that we're still fighting for just a modicum of power. And so if you all don't know what the current statistics are in animal welfare, the field is effectively 85% white and 85% female. And there's less than 1% of the leadership in animal welfare is African American, less than 1%. And so I live in Maryland, and specifically in Baltimore. There are large animal welfare organizations here in Baltimore, large animal welfare organizations in DC, large animal welfare organizations in Atlanta, Georgia. And if you can bind them all together, I am the single ED, executive director, CEO of those three states combined. And all of, colloquially, we refer to those cities as chocolate cities because of their large African-American population. I've not been to any of those cities and not found passionate animal welfare advocates, not found geniuses, not found attorneys of color who are interested in animal welfare. So I think the community of animal welfare leadership in animal welfare management has to start asking itself some incredibly critical questions about what it is, who it is we are, and who do we want to be in the future, because history is the becoming of something else. And currently the becoming does not include people of color unless we have to start something like CARE just to put ourselves and our minds on the map. So there's lots of work to be done. But speaking of critical, I'm going to give both of you a minute to sort of dip into this debate on critical race theory, which I almost can't believe we're even talking about it. But I think this is a good conversation in context of American Black history. So where are you on this debate, if you want to call it a debate at all? I'll start with Akisha.
Critical race theory. Where to begin? I mean, we've had so many states introduce various bills around something that was really not even taught in public schools to begin with. Critical race theory is rooted in legal theory. You're not going to have kindergartnners talking about the depth that it touches, but we have a debate that has emerged that says it is. But what these bills do, a variety of things depending on what state you're in. In my state, several bills have been introduced to prevent certain concepts. That's very broad, concepts around race, racial discrimination, systemic racism, different buzzwords that cannot be used or incorporated into the curriculum. What that does, obviously, it causes more erasure. We celebrate Black History Month in so many schools in the Commonwealth. Well, some of these bills passed that might no longer be a possibility to even learn about Black history. So that's one possibility because part of what these bills touch on are the feelings of students. So if a student is caused to feel shame about their race because of something they've learned that happened either in the past or something that's going on right now, they can bring an action to penalize the teacher and the school district for introducing that concept into the classroom. So that's
sorry, but just for clarity, mostly for the audience clarity. So what you're saying is a white student who is being exposed to a fact about African American history, particularly that African Americans were held as slaves and that most of that was torturous, that, medical history, Harvard and Yale and other schools used Black folks and did experiments, some even without anesthesia. These are all facts. So you're saying a white student exposed to that could then bring action on his or her teacher.
That's right. Under some of these bills, that's absolutely right. If it causes discomfort, some states have allowed for exceptions for historical facts. Others have not. It's just about the feeling. But the interesting thing about that, James, is it doesn't say that only white students can bring actions.
Right.
It applies to any student. It just lets you know that they're only thinking about certain types of students, because there are many Black students who feel ashamed because their race isn't represented, right? So nobody thought about that possibility. So now, these bills are being reworded and reworked and whatnot. But I think the really important thing to emphasize here, so I have a history of working full-time in the animal welfare, animal protection field. And also outside of that, being a grassroots advocate and being passionate about a variety of issues impacting my community. And I've always felt that they have been integrated, but we operate in silos. And I'm always frustrated when I hear, well, this is really an other issue. It's not our issue. That's an issue over there. That is and another social justice movement. Well, I'll tell you, some of the critical race theory bills, some of the efforts that I've seen have gone so far as to not only touch on race, but to touch on any issue that could be controversial. So far, there have been some efforts to ban organizations that engage in any type of lobbying from the classroom that has nothing to do with race. If you can imagine, any nonprofit has engaged in some level of lobbying. Maybe it's lobbying for pandemic relief for nonprofits, right? I mean,
or clean water?
Exactly. And clean water, access to, better educational materials, service learning, any number of things, and really it's the advocates that are outside of our movement that are working to stop these dangerous bills from going forward. And that's another type of, to the extent that they're not acknowledged and helping create space for the animal welfare movement to do their work. That's also another form of erasure in my mind.
And another form of erasure coming on the heels of all that are voting acts being repealed all over the country. I mean, it is, I think the thing that surprises me, including January, the observation of January 6th, last year, it is this population of Americans that fail to see how draconian the world is for people of color, and how it impacts them as Americans. Because in my mind, if we're talking about reciprocity and we're talking about progress and we're talking about sharing wealth and sharing power, if the current facts are correct and African American wealth is only 13% of white wealth in terms of median household income, what would happen if the country pitched in the other direction to bring us even? To me, the whole harbor rises, because we would be buying things. We would be buying houses. We would be buying property. And currently we would have to buy that from white folks. I mean, so it's obviously racism is not logical. It's an emotional thing. It's connected to a lot of things that are steeped in selfishness, and I wouldn't call it evilness, but it just strikes me, and it's related to this field as well. The absence of people of color in this field, to me, just mathematically means that less animals are being helped, less animals are being adopted. Our organizations are not being funded by BIPOC folks, many of which have money to give. And so with that, Mueni, you want to dip into, and by all means add in on the critical race theory, but what does reciprocity look like? Or what should it look like?
Okay. Well, I live in the Gulf Coast. I live in Texas. So definitely seeing the effects of pushback from critical race theory. When I was in public school in Houston, Texas, there were even history books that were calling slaves indentured servants just to avoid, accurate terminology. From what I've read more recently, large state officials here in Texas are banning the use of any topics surrounding the Klan, surrounding Jim Crow, surrounding anything after Emancipation Proclamation. So it was Black folks were freed and then they were happy. So, that's pretty much the consensus here in Texas. But reciprocity, I love bringing it back to reciprocity. A lot of us can't control. There's a little level of control, and I hope people are starting to sign up for elections and choose who's on their school board so they can really have an impact of what's being taught in schools. But outside of that, reciprocity and animal welfare, and just in general, I think it's a bit of two things. It's the exchange that's happening between historically privileged people and historically oppressed people, specifically Black people in this conversation. If there is no exchange happening and you're just extracting, you're causing harm. And if that exchange isn't consent for Black people or whatever other historically oppressed group you're working with, then you are creating violence and harm. I also think a part of it is where you are in the movement. If you aren't doing the work as an individual, as an institution, whatever space you take up, to look within yourself and understand how you are exerting harm and violence on others, then you are not in alignment with the movement, and you should not go as far as to call yourself an ally or to announce yourself as anything other than what you are. And so I think that reciprocity comes from having ownership, like I talked a little bit about before, ownership over your position in this space and in this movement, and actively challenging that and working on it on a regular basis, to have some reciprocity with whatever group you're working with.
Yeah. I love that, and I love the idea, and I've heard a lot of folks speaking to it, mostly BIPOC or Black folks speaking to this idea that one should not name themselves an ally. I will tell you, and I'm not naming names obviously, but if the people, and I think it's people, not organizations, that have been pushing back on care since the very beginning, were the very same people who had named themselves as Black allies within the animal welfare space. I mean, it's if I didn't have a history and an understanding that was going to happen, it would have shocked me. But I mean, you could. Folks out there that think of a name, any name that pops into your head as someone that has been at a presentation talking about Black Lives Matter and how animal welfare has left Black folks out. Those are the same people that are pushing back on care. Those are the same people that I get hate mail from, and I get hate mail. Just recently, I got hate mail from someone from New Jersey, a white man from New Jersey who is an animal welfare advocate, literally saying that care, and myself in particular, weren't doing enough for Black folks in New Jersey, and that I was a fraud and that care was a fraud and all these kinds of things. And I thought to myself, this is where we are. This is a white man emailing a Black man about how the Black man is not doing enough for Black people. And so there's this constant erasure, no matter what field you are in, no matter how committed, no matter how much you sacrifice, there is a machine, a system of erasure that, again, I think we're fighting it back against with as much radical love as possible. But we don't have the numbers in this country, I think, to move Black folks and Black communities as far as they could be. We're going to have to find real allies, and those allies, I think, are going to have to start sacrificing in ways that really shows them to show up, because we literally don't have the numbers, and we don't have the wealth to do what needs to be done. But speaking of Black radical love, and I don't really see it as radical, but last night, watching you, Mueni, with all of the proximate leaders, I would have never described it as radical. It's what I grew up with. I grew up with incredibly poor people that knew how to love on one another. And so I keep hearing people saying that our talks have been really amazing. And I love that, but it's so familiar to me. Those exchanges, that love, that grace, that nothing about it seems radical. But to the extent that it's a term, what comes to mind, Akisha and Mueni?
Let me actually, because I wanted to share something when I heard Mueni talk about bell hooks and radical love. So there is, oh nope, hold on.
There you go. That's good.
There we go. Okay. I'm reading this book called I need to get it right in the right spot.
Yeah, there you go. All About Love.
All About Love by Bell Hooks, who is a Kentuckian. She just passed away. Amazing contributor. Just an amazing person. I really enjoyed Mueni's program and with Approximate Leaders last night as well. And it is kind of a reunion in some sort because in some way, because I have been involved in the movement in various capacities for a while now, and I have not had that space of connection and fellowship and support that I think is just inherent to what I'm used to in other programs about, really acknowledging one another and uplifting one another in the work and giving space. I think that, when you're used to living in a world that doesn't allow you that benefit in a variety of circumstances, you become all the more appreciative. Yeah, I mean, I just, I can't say enough about the power of proximate leaders and uplifting one another.
Yeah. Mueni.
Yeah, thank you. I would definitely say yesterday was an act of Black radical love and encourage folks here who weren't able to join us to look, around March to see our full list of recordings and check us out. Check that one out. I think within our group, I think within the Black community, it's my job and as a light-skinned Black woman to bring dark-skinned Black femmes and women identifying people to the forefront, Black disabled folks, Black neurodiverse folks, Black children. And so, while James is bringing, folks like Akisha and I along and amplifying our voices, as a community, that's us doing that work of amplifying the folks that are experiencing different oppressions while being Black, but for non-Black people, that Black radical love is positioning yourself in ways that amplify and reduce harm for the Black people in your life, the Black people within your proximity, and having an intentional look at the people in your community, in your life. It's so interesting to see after the murder of George Floyd, thousands of white people talk about George Floyd, but not talk about the Black person that was murdered by police in their zip code. And so it's so easy to do that from afar. And so I think that love is doing it right at home, right at your job, right in your neighborhood, on the homeowners association, and all of those things, making it really intentional and having ownership in that way.
Wow. I've often talked about during this whole process of care and that we view history in a very linear way, that, there are these little tick marks on a timeline that give us the impression that we've left one place and gone to another place. And lately I've been thinking about it as more as a seed. Right. And America's seed was, we like to think of it as a seed of independence, which it was, but at what cost, right? We purchased our independence on the backs of Black people. So our seed is essentially immoral. Our seed is violent. Our seed is racist. and we grew into a racist tree. And so much of the fruit of that tree, which is systematic racism, like you can think of, to me, I think of systematic racism as an organism, as a seed that has grown into a very, very large tree. And the tree itself is a byproduct of its beginning. And so I think that changing the nature of that tree requires that we start adding other branches of other trees to it so that the fruit changes, right? If you want a different type of result from a plant, you have to bind another plant to it. And I am completely suspending with this concept that even that slavery is over. I think slavery metamorphosized into the prison industrial complex, which is very well covered in the 13th. And I think it's hard for non-Black folks to see that because the overt violence that's associated with Jim Crow, with lynching, and with slavery is not present all the time. And so the lack of freedom is also not present. So for me, the lack of freedom is doing what I want to do without fear. And as a Black man in particular, a large Black man, there is nothing that I do on a daily basis outside of my house that I can do without fear. I am constantly afraid of the police. I am constantly afraid of being pulled over. I am constantly afraid of being confused with someone else. And that's not freedom. That is a lower version of freedom, and it comes directly from fruit from a tree, the strangest fruit imaginable. And so with that, talk to me about the threat of systematic racism and how do you all see changing it, moving it so that it's not so systematic and maybe the system backs up and takes a look at itself, if that's at all possible?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. We had a series, our Black History Month series, a couple of weeks ago, or was it last week, that we were focusing on redlining. And, following up on, what Mueni just said, I was just, definitely resonate with not causing harm and being an active, don't name yourself as an ally, but definitely be an active participant in reducing harm. And your guest had a very interesting proposition. I raised a question. I happen to be in a neighborhood where a lot of people are moving out. I grew up in this neighborhood, but because of the demographic shift and because of the school system, which is now rapidly becoming majority minority, there's a mad dash out of the neighborhood. There are flyers and mailboxes saying, "Don't you want to move to this neighborhood over here?" I don't know how many flyers I've picked up. I don't know if they know who we are. Maybe they've seen that we've been here for a while. But your panelist said, "You know what? You need to stay in that neighborhood. You need to stay in the neighborhood because it's the right thing to do." But eventually, the property issues that people perceive are not going to be, they're not going to really be met out in the long run. And there are ways to push to make sure that properties don't get devalued and dilapidated or whatnot.
Can you share what you share with me? Hopefully, I'm not going to tell it if you don't want to tell it, about what a neighbor said to you a few weeks ago about your presence in the neighborhood.
Yeah, actually, no, that's a great story. It was a little while ago. It does seem like it was not that long ago, but I share this story all of the time. It takes a lot longer for someone like me to find housing, regardless of the price point. We have racial covenants that were in existence, racially restrictive covenants that were on the books as late as 2014. Maybe there still are some around. They're not legally enforceable, of course, but they prohibit certain homes from being sold to a Black person or anybody who's not white. And that legacy still exists. So I actually was looking for a place to rent when I was first coming back to the state to help with the parent. And I was being shown a property, and there was another African American woman behind me. The neighbor runs over, she sees us, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, not in my neighborhood. You are not moving into my neighborhood." So she runs in, she stops the showing, and she says, "I hate to tell you this, but we live in a nice neighborhood. We have doctors and attorneys that live around here. We want to keep this a nice neighborhood." And just stopped there, didn't say anything else. And I'm like, this is just shocking on so many different levels. She ran in and interrupted everything, said that, and didn't have anything else to say. So I just said, well, I'm an attorney. I was like, thank you. I'm an attorney, but yeah, I mean, we still deal with these types of things. These types of discussions, by the way, would also be banned under critical race theory legislation. So we can't actually talk about what's happening in the present day. But yeah, I mean, it's just a shocking story, that unfortunately, I have a friend who, she is a single mom. She has pretty she's working class. She's able to go in and get any home she wants, with very, very little difficulty. It takes her about a month at most. Whereas for me and my husband, when we're an interracial couple, it would take close to a year to find something on average.
Thank you for sharing that, by the way. I often tell folks that are not BIPOC that in anything socially measurable, whether it is infant mortality, whether it's women dying in childbirth, housing, you name it, measure it, even COVID. Black folks are suffering on a daily basis disproportionate to their white counterparts. And if that's not a metamorphosis of slavery and classism, I don't know what is. So the only other reasonable explanation for people of color always being on the bottom of those statistics, if it's not a system, then it's a bell curve. Then you're telling me that we are incapable of ascending. And so for me, non-BIPOCs have to choose. Either you believe that I'm inferior, or you have to admit that you're part of a system that is suppressing Black people, Black bodies, Black excellence. And then the next choice is, what are you going to do about breaking that system apart, starting with your personal behavior and your personal choices? How do you become a disruptor, as Mueni and Johnny like to say? Because the data is there. There is no way you can ignore those facts. So I think it's time for decisions to be made. I don't know if you want to add on, Mueni, because we're at the hour.
Sure. I'll quickly say that it's sometimes easy for a lot of white people to distance themselves from very overt racism. And I'm sure folks, I'm seeing in the chat, folks are really surprised to have seen or hear, excuse me, that Akisha has experienced this. And I just want to, really run it home that, outside of the respectability politics that I don't want to get into, and every Black person's life matters, folks with high level degrees and doing really amazing things in organizations like Akisha and I, and James, excuse me, are reduced to the color of our skin, and we are experiencing violence and harm. My first job in animal welfare, the third day there, I had high level staff ask me, am I on colored people time? And it was appropriate and it was normalized in that setting. And so, I'm here to tell you that it's easy to think about, that white saviorism, that you feel good about giving free services to Black, lower income folks in your community, or that you serve with your shelter or whatever your nonprofit is. But it's a lot harder to look in that mirror for the Black professionals and the people that you haven't deemed as at need. And so I really encourage folks to really do some reflection on the way that they amplify or even just treat the Black professionals in their life in this work.
Yeah, I have to get my tambourine back on my desk. But I will tell you all that I have been handcuffed probably 6 times, just dressed exactly the way that I'm dressed right this moment. I don't wear hoodies. I'm not in public. Actually, Sterling was staying with us, and we got into the car, and it was cold out. This is Sterling Trap King Davis. Sterling and I were in the front seat, and it was cold out, and we noticed that we both had our hoodies up. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I was like, and we both put our hoodies down out of fear that 2 Black men driving a newish SUV might cause too much attention. These are not the 1920s, but this is the reality that we live in. And it's just, it hurts. I don't know how to describe it, to be who I am, and then to be reduced, using Mueni's words, to, it's not even reduced. I'm not even that thing. You know what I mean? It's a really interesting place to be, including in this field. But I know there are lots of questions. I do want to point out that our REDI coursework, it is not a DEI course. That was one of the first things Mueni said to me when we took our long walk interview. Well, she did not want to call this DEI, and Johnny Jenkins renamed the coursework REDI for racial equity, diversity, and inclusion, because we want to prioritize racial equity. So that coursework is going to be ready, no pun intended, is going to be ready in probably 2 weeks. So if you're interested in hearing more perspectives and more lessons and getting certification from CARE, I think Jen is going to drop the link to signing up for REDI in the chat. And with that, I just want to thank Mueni and Akisha. I think you're both amazing human beings, and with giant brains that hopefully everyone here and abroad will learn from. I appreciate everyone joining. I know some of these topics are difficult, but I in particular appreciate Maddie's. CARE would be here, but we would be here at a much lesser capacity, including the folks on this call, if it weren't for organizations like Maddie's Fund. And to be quite frank, I think the changes that are going to happen in animal welfare, the big changes are going to happen from top down, because the field is unregulated. There's no governance really of the field. So donors and foundations like Maddie's Fund, I think, are going to change the landscape forever. And so we appreciate you. All right. Have a good night.